I never thought I'd end up here, a guy sitting alone, going over the wreckage of his marriage. To anyone else, Beth and I are that couple, the one that everyone points to as proof it can work. We met as teenagers, high school sweethearts, and made it through college, jobs, and a life built brick by brick. Beth is a powerhouse. She works in marketing, always onto some new campaign or branding project. I teach high school biology, coach football, and keep to a routine. Together, we look like we have it all. The nice house, the holiday photos, friends who see us as the glue of our social circle. Beth and I have shared the same friends for years. They've seen us grow, change, and settle into this life together. We're the kind of couple who throws dinner parties, the ones whose living room is filled with laughter every weekend. People think we're seamless, two parts of a whole. And for a long time, I thought that was true. Then, there's my younger brother, Jared. He's not like me. Jared's always been the risk taker, the thrill chaser. He's got this wild streak, the kind of person who'd take off on a whim to some beach or city without so much as a plan. He's charming, everyone likes him, but he's never been the kind to stay put. He's always been a drifter, coming back to town whenever he needs a break from his own chaotic life. I never minded that he'd always flit in and out. He's my brother, and you accept family, even when you don't understand them. Beth seemed to admire Jared's freedom. She'd laugh at his wild stories and call him a free spirit, always joking about how Jared lived by his own rules. I thought she was humoring him. Beth and I had chosen stability and consistency, and I figured that's what she wanted too. Maybe I was just a fool who didn't see what was right in front of me. About a year ago, Beth's job got more intense. She was working long hours, coming home drained, her mind always somewhere else. I knew marketing was a demanding field, so I didn't think much of it at first. But then I started noticing little things. She'd sit on the couch texting, and when I asked, she'd say it was work stuff. I tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut, telling myself that I was just imagining things. I didn't want to be one of those paranoid husbands. Beth deserved her privacy, and I wanted to trust her. But the distance kept growing. There were nights she'd come home late, smelling like someone else's cologne, brushing me off with excuses. She'd laugh off my questions, call me paranoid. I'd hear the edge in her voice, see the way her eyes slid away from mine, and the knot in my stomach tightened. It wasn't like her to be so evasive. I wanted to confront her, but I couldn't bear the thought of what I might hear. I convinced myself it was just stress. Hers, mine, both of ours. But deep down, I knew. One evening, Beth's phone buzzed on the table, and without thinking, I looked. Jared's name flashed across the screen. It was innocent enough, right? Beth and Jared had always been friendly. Still, something in me stirred, a flash of something I couldn't put my finger on. She brushed it off when I asked, saying they'd just been talking about some family thing. But I noticed that the texts started coming more frequently. Jared had never been the kind to text at all hours, but now, it seemed like he and Beth had some constant thread running between them. Then, one night, I couldn't shake the feeling anymore. Beth had fallen asleep, and her phone buzzed beside me, Jared's name lighting up the screen again. I took a deep breath and unlocked it. What I found, it was like the ground gave way beneath me. The messages weren't explicit, nothing anyone else would notice right away. But they had this familiarity, a warmth that cut me to my core. Had a great time last night, one message read. I keep thinking about it, said another. They spoke in code, using half-sentences and inside jokes I didn't understand, but the intent was all there. I knew, even if my mind didn't want to accept it. My wife and my brother, the two people I trusted most in this world. Beth lay next to me, peaceful and unaware of the storm she'd set off inside me. I could have woken her up right then, let loose the anger and betrayal that were clawing up my throat, but something in me held back. I wasn't about to let my emotions take over. Not yet. Instead, I lay there in the dark, my fists clenched, my mind racing. I wasn't going to let this break me. I'd spent my life being steady, being reliable, and for once, that wasn't a weakness. Beth and Jared had taken my trust and ground it into the dirt, and they would pay for it. But I wasn't going to scream, or plead, or beg. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. Beth thought she could lie beside me, play house, and keep on with her charade. And Jared? He'd waltzed back into town like he always did, expecting the same old, loyal brother he'd always known. But they didn't know me as well as they thought they did. Not anymore. As I lay there, my mind started churning, a plan forming slowly, piece by piece. I'd play along, bide my time, and give them just enough rope to hang themselves with. And when the moment was right, I'd make sure they'd feel every ounce of what they'd done to me. Because some betrayals cut too deep to forgive. And some people, no matter how close, don't get a second chance. The morning after I found those messages, I felt like I was watching Beth through a stranger's eyes. She moved around the kitchen, pouring coffee and scrolling through her phone, her face lighting up every time it buzzed. I knew it was Jared, my own damn brother. She tried to hide it, masking the glow of her smile, but I saw everything. And instead of confronting her, something in me went cold. I left for work that morning with a plan beginning to take shape. I wasn't going to lose my head over this. No shouting, no pleading, none of that. If Beth wanted to betray me, and if Jared wanted to ruin the only thing holding us together, they would pay. But it would be on my terms, not theirs. When I walked into my classroom that morning, I knew I'd have to compartmentalize, keep my students from seeing any cracks in my armor. I'm known as the steady teacher, the one who can handle anything. I didn't need questions or sympathy. I wanted control. It wasn't until I was driving home later that day, the wheels turning under me and the open road stretching out, that the first piece of my plan fell into place. Beth and I share a close-knit group of friends in our small town. They've been in our lives since high school, back when we all thought love was as simple as choosing someone and staying. They'd believe almost anything I said, especially if I played it right. So I started small. That evening, when Beth left the room to take one of her work calls, I sent a casual text to Sarah, one of our closest friends. "Hey, have you been?" I wrote. I kept it short, knowing she'd bite. Sarah's always been the one to lean in close, to listen, to pull things out of people that they might not otherwise say. I knew it wouldn't take long for her to notice something was up, and she'd be more than willing to listen. Sarah texted back quickly, and our conversation started with the usual catch-up. Then, I let it slip that things have been rough at home, hinting just enough to make her curious. Sarah's response was exactly what I'd expected, a concerned question, the kind that signals an open door. I told her it was probably nothing, just the strain of Beth's work. But I knew Sarah, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her mind, wondering about Beth's late hours and the tension between us. Over the next few days, I kept up the same act. Every time we gathered with friends, I let them see a different side of me. The quiet, slightly distant husband, the one who seemed to be holding something back. Our friends began to notice, especially when Beth would step away from the group, phone in hand, her face lighting up with that same secretive smile. I didn't have to say much. Just the way I looked at her, the way I lingered in silence, was enough to plant the seeds. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. I stopped by Sarah's house one evening, telling her I needed to talk. It was just the two of us, and she listened as I talked about Beth's distance, her late nights, my fears about losing her. Sarah's hand lingered on mine for a beat longer than necessary, and I knew right then she was beginning to feel sympathy, maybe even attraction. I wasn't interested in Sarah. I was interested in how her whispers would spread. In our town, news doesn't just spread. It grows, branching out like wildfire. And I knew Sarah well enough to know that soon, everyone in our circle would start looking at Beth with new eyes. I could see it working already. At the next gathering, Beth's friends gave her little looks, raised brows when she got up to take another call. Beth, oblivious as ever, kept playing her part, acting the devoted wife while slipping into her secret world every chance she got. At home, I kept Beth at arm's length. Whenever she reached out, I brushed her off with a smile, the kind that says, "I'm fine," even when she knew something was off. She started watching me, sensing the shift, her irritation turning to something close to worry. I let her stew in it, answering her questions with vague replies and sidelong glances. It was subtle, but I knew she felt it. I wanted her to feel it, wanted her to wonder what was slipping away. I could sense her frustration building, and I was careful to stay just out of reach, giving her that taste of isolation she'd been dishing out to me for months. She tried to bait me a few times, poking at me with little comments about how busy she was, as if to provoke me. But I wasn't taking the bait. I'd become an expert at maintaining control, at giving her nothing. And in the meantime, I watched as the tension within our friends started to shift. Sarah was no longer looking at Beth the same way. Conversations among our group were marked by careful silences, little glances exchanged when Beth would walk into the room. And through it all, I remained the steady one, the quiet husband bearing some unspoken burden. Beth thought she could keep her secret buried, that I'd stay the same quiet, trusting husband I'd always been. But she didn't realize how quickly a quiet man can turn into something else. And by the time she did, it would be far too late. The morning after I read those texts from Jared, everything felt surreal. Beth was already up, pouring coffee and scrolling through her phone, smiling at whatever she saw on the screen. I knew it was him. She didn't even try to hide it anymore, like I'd become invisible, just background noise in her life. I'd always been the steady one, the dependable husband who wouldn't make a scene. But that morning, something inside me shifted. This time, I wasn't going to let it slide. Leaving the house, I forced myself to focus on my day at school. My students didn't need to see my turmoil, and I refused to bring this mess into the classroom. But as I drove home that evening, a plan began to form. Beth thought she could keep lying to my face, that I'd go on oblivious. But she was wrong. I'd make her regret it, but I'd do it quietly with the patience she thought I'd lost. Our friends would be my first step. In a small town like ours, everyone knows everyone's business, and once rumors start, they spread like wildfire. Sarah, one of our oldest friends, was my first choice. Beth had always liked her, and Sarah was the kind of person who was always drawn to a good story, especially one that hinted at trouble in paradise. So that night, I messaged her, something simple to open the door. "Hey, how have you been?" Sarah responded immediately, her usual upbeat tone tinged with curiosity. It didn't take much to get her interested. I let a few things slip, little hints that maybe Beth and I weren't as solid as people thought. "It's probably just work stress," I'd say. "She's been distant." I saw Sarah's face soften as she probed for more details, her eyes lighting up with a sympathy that felt too personal. Perfect. I didn't need to say more. With Sarah, all it took was a few choice words, and she'd take it from there. Beth didn't notice at first. She was too busy with her work calls, too wrapped up in her secret with Jared to see what I was doing. But as the days passed, I could see her start to pick up on the subtle changes around her. Our friends, once warm and open, had become guarded around her. They'd cast glances when she entered a room or exchange knowing looks that made her pause. She began to notice the tension, her smiles slipping as she scanned the room, looking for answers. One night, after I'd stayed out late, she confronted me in the dark. "Are you happy, Mike?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She sounded unsure, almost vulnerable. I just shrugged, gave her a casual sure, and turned over, leaving her with nothing but silence. I knew it would eat at her, that feeling of being dismissed, shut out of the life she thought she controlled. The next time we had a group dinner, I made sure to sit beside Sarah. It wasn't much, just small touches on her arm, a few shared laughs, but I saw the impact it had on Beth. She kept glancing over, her eyes narrowing each time Sarah leaned in close. I knew she was getting uncomfortable, the realization that things weren't as she'd assumed beginning to dawn on her. Over the following days, Beth grew more anxious. I kept her guessing, kept my movements vague, spending nights out with our friends, but leaving details purposefully unclear. I knew she was waiting for me to open up, to pull her back in, but I gave her nothing. When she tried to talk, I'd wave it off with a smile, telling her I understood how busy she was with work. Then one night, she finally broke. As we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, she looked at me, her expression tense and hesitant. "Have you noticed anything weird with our friends lately?" she asked, her voice shaky. I met her gaze with a blank expression, shrugging as if it meant nothing to me. "Maybe people just get busy, Beth," I said, as casually as I could manage. The lie came easily, and I saw the confusion flicker across her face. She looked like she wanted to say something else but stopped herself, finally giving a slight nod before going to bed without another word. As I watched her walk away, I knew I was winning. She'd started this game, but I was going to finish it. Slowly, subtly, I'd make her feel what she'd put me through, and I wouldn't have to raise my voice or make a single accusation to do it. By the time she understood, it would be too late. Every day, Beth grew more uneasy. She'd catch me staring, watchful, and shift in her seat. Her patience with me was wearing thin, but I could see her fighting to keep up the illusion of control. Meanwhile, I kept my own actions subtle but deliberate, just enough to leave her wondering. Our friends were already in on the narrative I'd been feeding them. Beth's distance, my quiet concern, hints at trouble I was too private to discuss in detail. Sarah, especially, was eager to be there for me, her hand resting on my shoulder a beat too long, her gaze warm with sympathy. The more I spoke to her, the more she leaned in, absorbing every word. I knew she wouldn't keep our conversations to herself. In a town like ours, gossip traveled fast. Beth noticed the change in our circle. At a dinner party one weekend, she caught Sarah and me laughing together, Sarah's hand brushing my arm. I could feel Beth's eyes on us, her forced smile wavering, questions pooling behind her gaze. She wasn't used to being on the outside, but that was exactly where I wanted her to be. Then, one night as we were getting ready for bed, Beth finally asked, her voice tight, Have you been talking to people about us, Mike?" I looked at her with a calm expression, feigning surprise. "Why would you think that, Beth?" I asked. "I wouldn't bring our private issues to friends. That's not who I am." She seemed taken aback, her mouth opening as if to say something, but she stopped herself. That was the thing about lies. They're hard to keep straight, especially when you're the only one clinging to them. Each night, she grew more tense. I'd sit beside her on the couch, watching her scroll through her phone, hoping I couldn't see the guilt simmering beneath her calm exterior. And every night, I gave her nothing but silence. Eventually, she started reaching out to me, her hand on mine, her voice filled with forced affection, as if reminding herself that we were still us. But I was done playing that part. I was careful, never giving her a reason to feel secure. Instead, I kept myself occupied, spending more time out of the house, never saying where I was going. I knew it would eat at her, wondering where I was, who I was with, and why I suddenly seemed content without her. She'd try to ask, but I'd brush her off with a casual, just grabbing a drink with a friend. One evening, when I finally came home late, she was waiting. She'd made an effort, hair done, her best dress on, a strained smile on her face. "I thought maybe we could talk," she said, gesturing to the table where she'd set out a meal. I shrugged, nonchalant. "Sure, let's talk." We sat across from each other, and for the first time in a while, I saw her truly at a loss. She fumbled, searching for words, as if trying to salvage something that had long since slipped away. "Are you happy, Mike?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. I gave her a slow look, letting her feel the weight of the silence between us. "I'm just tired, Beth. Tired of being the one holding everything together." Her face fell, and for a moment, I almost felt a pang of something close to pity, but I pushed it aside. She wanted to live with secrets, wanted to tear down everything we'd built together. Well, now she could face the consequences. I stood up, muttering a quick good night, and left her sitting alone at the table. The next day, I decided to step things up. I reached out to Sarah, inviting her to grab a drink after work. Nothing too obvious, but enough to raise eyebrows if someone saw us. When we met, I kept the conversation light, watching as she leaned closer, her sympathy mingling with something else, a warmth that told me she believed every word of my carefully crafted story. By the time I got home, Beth was wide awake, her eyes filled with unspoken questions. I didn't give her a chance to ask. I climbed into bed, facing away, pretending to fall asleep. I could feel her watching me, the tension in her silence almost tangible. And as I lay there, I knew my plan was working. Beth was beginning to feel what I'd felt, the gnawing distrust, the doubt creeping in at every turn. She didn't know how much I knew, and I intended to keep it that way. It was at a friend's birthday party a few days later when I finally saw Beth crack. The whole evening, I stayed close to Sarah, keeping our conversation light but personal, throwing in the occasional joke and subtle smile. I knew Beth was watching from across the room, her forced laugh and tense glances revealing how rattled she was. She hadn't expected to feel like an outsider among her own friends, but that's exactly where I wanted her. At one point, I caught her watching me, her gaze full of questions she wouldn't ask. I raised my drink and gave her a casual nod, acting oblivious to the silent turmoil I knew she was feeling. The look in her eyes lingered with suspicion, maybe even jealousy, a reflection of all the things she'd been putting me through without a second thought. Finally, she couldn't hold back any longer. She walked over, brushing off her forced smile as she pulled me aside. Her voice was low, steady, but I could hear the edge in it. "Mike, can we talk? Just for a second." I led her out onto the balcony, keeping my expression neutral. She looked over her shoulder to make sure we were alone, then took a deep breath as if bracing herself. "Mike," she started, her words coming out haltingly, "I don't know what's going on with you lately. You're out all the time, and when you are home, you barely even look at me. I feel like you're pulling away." The nerve of it almost made me laugh. She was the one with secrets and excuses, late-night work calls, and texts from my own brother. And now she wanted to play the concerned wife, as if she hadn't been doing exactly what she was accusing me of. But I kept my expression calm, letting her finish. "It feels like I don't know you anymore," she said, her voice softening, as if pleading for something she'd already destroyed. I raised an eyebrow, crossing my arms as I looked at her. "That's funny, Beth," I replied evenly, "because from where I'm standing, I don't think you've wanted to know me for a long time." She blinked, caught off guard, her mouth opening slightly before she looked down, words failing her. I could see her calculating, weighing her next move, trying to figure out if she'd reveal too much by pushing back. I almost hoped she'd say it, admit what she'd been doing, but she stayed silent, struggling to keep the mask on. "Look," I continued, my tone casual, "I'm not the one who changed. I've been here, Beth. If things feel different to you, maybe you should be asking yourself why." A flicker of guilt crossed her face, but she quickly buried it, shaking her head. "I just want things to go back to normal," she said, her voice almost desperate. "Normal?" I echoed, a bitter laugh escaping before I could stop it. "You really think we can just pretend nothing's happened?" She looked up, her expression guarded, as if searching for any hint that I knew the truth. But I held her gaze, giving nothing away. After a long silence, she finally gave a small nod, as if defeated. "Fine," I said, nodding as if her words meant anything. "Let's pretend it's all normal." Without another word, I turned and walked back inside, leaving her alone in the cool night air. For the rest of the evening, Beth was quiet, retreating to the edges of conversations, her usual confidence shaken. I watched her, feeling that familiar satisfaction as she began to sense her own isolation, to realize that she wasn't as in control as she'd thought. The friends who used to look at us as the perfect couple now cast subtle, knowing glances her way. And I knew she felt it, that silent judgment, the way they whispered just low enough for her to hear. When we finally left, she was withdrawn, her mind clearly running through every interaction, every conversation she hadn't been able to control. In the car, she was silent, staring out the window as if trying to make sense of what was slipping through her fingers. That night, she came into our bedroom and stood by the doorway, looking as if she was trying to muster the courage to speak. I kept my back to her, watching her reflection in the mirror as she opened her mouth, then closed it, thinking better of it. After a few seconds, she turned away, the soft click of the door closing behind her. She was feeling the distance, the cold edge of loneliness she'd brought upon herself, and it gave me a satisfaction that was almost calming. I knew this was only the beginning. I'd continue to play this game of silence and distance, letting her wonder, letting her feel the doubt she'd created in me. She wanted secrets. Now she could live with them. I'd make sure that by the time she figured it out, the world she thought she knew would be nothing but ashes. After that night, Beth became almost frantic in her attempts to reconnect. She'd linger by me in the mornings, make small talk over coffee, even try to reminisce about the old days. But I wasn't giving her anything. I let her stew, let her dig herself deeper into a paranoia I knew was growing with every silent drive home, every evening I spent out with friends, every indifferent shrug. The strange thing was, I found I wasn't just pretending anymore. I didn't care to fix things. The anger that had burned hot when I first found those messages between her and Jared had cooled into something harder, colder. I had no interest in the woman who stood across from me now, desperate for reassurance I'd never give. One night, I took it up a notch. I texted Sarah again, inviting her to join me for a drink. She was more than happy to meet, leaning into our quiet, private chats with a warmth I knew she didn't hide from her friends. I drop hints here and there about how lonely I'd felt lately, about how things had changed between Beth and me. Sarah soaked up every word, her sympathy only drawing her closer to my side. We met at a cozy bar in town, one where we knew everyone, the kind of place Beth would hear about without me having to say a word. I kept things friendly, but let the conversation get personal enough to raise questions. Sarah, as always, was happy to listen, her hand resting on mine a little longer than necessary, her smile warm and understanding. I watched her reaction carefully, not because I wanted anything from her, but because I knew the story would travel. By the time I came home that night, Beth was waiting for me, her arms crossed, eyes full of questions she wasn't quite brave enough to ask. "Where were you?" she managed, her voice forced and tight. I shrugged. "Just out. Needed a drink after a long day," I said, not meeting her eyes, my tone casual. "With Sarah?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I turned to her, raising an eyebrow as if her question surprised me. "Yeah, she wanted to catch up," I replied easily. "You know how it is." The way she swallowed, the look of barely concealed panic in her eyes, those were all the answers I needed. She looked like she wanted to press further, to challenge me. But she held back, uncertainty stealing her words, because I knew she was afraid to push. She was losing her grip, and the realization was sinking in. In the days that followed, Beth's unease only deepened. She'd hover around me in the mornings, her gaze flicking over me as if searching for cracks, but I gave her nothing. I went about my routines, working, going out with friends, and keeping my distance. And every time she tried to bring up us, I shrugged her off with polite disinterest. It wasn't long before she cracked again. We were at another friend's get-together, and I made sure to sit beside Sarah, letting her laughter carry across the room as she leaned in close. Beth watched us from the other side of the table, her face pale, her fingers twisting a napkin as if it were the only thing grounding her. She caught my eye a few times, but I held her gaze coolly, letting her see that I wasn't the same man she'd walked all over. Later that night, as we drove home, she finally spoke. "Mike, what's happening to us?" Her voice trembled, the desperation barely concealed. "You're different, distant. I feel like you're slipping away." "Slipping away?" I echoed, a cold smile tugging at my lips. "Beth, I'm exactly where I've always been. If anyone's slipping away, maybe you should take a good look in the mirror." She fell silent, her expression crumbling. I could see her reaching for words, trying to grasp some kind of control, but the truth was catching up to her. For the first time, she was facing the fallout of her choices, the consequences of tearing apart the life we'd built together. That night, she didn't try to follow me to bed. Instead, I heard her pacing in the kitchen, the low hum of her phone vibrating as she sat alone in the dark. I knew she was tempted to call Jared, to fall back into her old pattern, but I also knew she wouldn't risk it, not now. She was afraid, and for the first time, she was the one feeling trapped. The next morning, she looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her face drawn. She glanced at me, and for a moment, I almost saw a glimmer of the old Beth, the woman I'd once loved. But I pushed it away. The Beth I'd loved didn't exist anymore. She'd been replaced by a stranger who thought she could have it all and leave me none the wiser. Over the next few weeks, I kept her guessing, making sure she never found a foothold. When she tried to talk, I gave her nothing but a distant smile and vague reassurances that things were fine. I wanted her to feel what I'd felt, the emptiness, the betrayal, the slow realization that nothing was as it seemed. And as I watched her grow more uncertain, more isolated, I knew my plan was working. She'd wanted secrets, lies, and the thrill of a hidden life. Now she'd have all that, but not in the way she'd imagined. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about watching her fall, inch by inch, until she hit the ground and saw exactly what she'd done to us. And by then, it would be too late for anything else. The silence between us was now so thick you could feel it, hanging over every meal, every evening in our home. Beth was unraveling, and I could see it in every forced smile, every anxious glance she threw my way. Her once perfect mask was slipping, and she didn't know how to hold it together. I kept my routine going, coming and going without explanation, my actions calm and deliberate. If she'd ever trusted that I'd stay the same, predictable Mike, she was starting to realize her mistake. The game I was playing was subtle but constant, and Beth was finally the one on the outside, feeling like a stranger in her own life. It wasn't long before I started noticing her phone buzzing less often, her laughter on calls dwindling. She barely texted Jared anymore. Not because I'd told her not to, but because I'd made her too nervous to risk it. The idea of being caught had settled into her mind, and she was slowly cutting ties with him out of sheer paranoia. One night, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, she looked up at me, her face pale. She'd been poking at her food, barely eating, lost in her thoughts. Finally, she broke the silence. "Mike, do you ever feel like—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Like something's broken between us?" I raised an eyebrow, forcing myself to look at her as if she were a stranger. "I think we both know what's broken, Beth," I replied, my tone cold but calm. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked down, her face etched with guilt, her fingers clenched around her fork. For the first time in weeks, she looked like someone who understood that she'd made a mistake, like a person slowly realizing the impact of every secret, every lie. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Mike, I know I haven't been myself lately, and I know it feels like I'm far away." Her voice wavered, and she looked up at me, eyes pleading. "But I want to fix things. I want us back." I felt the anger flare up in me, barely contained. She wanted us back? The same us she'd lied to and betrayed? I looked at her, keeping my face neutral, and said, "I think it's a little late for that, don't you?" She flinched as if I'd slapped her, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She didn't know what I was capable of anymore, didn't know how to read me, and that terrified her. She'd always relied on me being the dependable one, the man who would bend over backward to keep things together. Now she was realizing that I was no longer that person. The next few days, Beth tried harder, almost frantically, to repair things between us. She cooked meals, tried to start small conversations, even asked if we could go on a weekend trip. I told her I'd think about it, keeping my responses short, letting her know I wasn't interested in playing house. I wanted her to feel the emptiness she'd brought into our lives, to understand that the life she'd thrown away could never come back. Meanwhile, I kept seeing Sarah. I'd started bringing her small gifts, a coffee, a book she'd mentioned liking. Nothing intimate, nothing crossing a line. But I knew that Beth would hear about it from our friends. I wanted her to wonder if she truly lost me, if I'd already moved on, or if she was simply witnessing the aftermath of her own betrayal. One evening, I came home later than usual, and Beth was waiting in the living room, pacing, her face pale and drawn. As soon as I walked in, she looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands trembling slightly. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice barely steady. I dropped my bag by the door, glancing at her with feigned indifference. "Just out," I replied, moving past her as if the question didn't matter. "With Sarah," she pressed, her tone sharp with accusation. I paused, turning back to meet her gaze. "What if I was?" I asked, letting my words hang in the air. Her face fell, and for a moment, I thought she might scream or shout. But instead, she swallowed, looking away, as if the answer hurt too much to bear. After a long silence, she looked back at me, her voice quieter. "Mike, are you trying to hurt me?" I almost laughed at the irony. "Why would I want to hurt you, Beth?" I replied, my tone calm and measured. "I'm just living my life." The look in her eyes was heartbreaking. It was like she was finally seeing me clearly, realizing that the life she'd taken for granted was no longer hers. And that was exactly what I wanted. She thought she could have it all, a husband who'd never question her, a lover on the side, a life untouched by consequence. But now, that illusion was crumbling, and she was left with nothing but her own regret. The days went on, and I kept up the game, watching her unravel bit by bit. Every time she tried to pull me back, I'd remind her with a simple look or cold reply that her betrayal had changed everything. Her guilt grew heavier, her nights longer, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she'd break completely. By the time she did, she'd understand exactly what it meant to betray someone who trusted you. And when that day came, I'd be there to see it all come down. It was inevitable, really. I'd been pushing her toward it for weeks, watching Beth hold on to the last bits of composure while I chipped away at the person she used to be. And finally, she broke. It was a Friday night. I had been out, telling her I had plans, without bothering to explain. I knew that would set her on edge, but it was all part of the game. When I walked through the door later that night, the house was dark except for a single lamp on in the living room. Beth was waiting for me, sitting stiffly on the couch, her face a mixture of exhaustion and barely held back fury. She didn't speak immediately, just looked at me with a quiet intensity that was almost unnerving. I dropped my bag by the door, keeping my face blank, waiting for her to make the first move. "Mike," she started, her voice low and controlled. "I can't do this anymore." I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "Do what, Beth?" "This," she gestured between us, her hand trembling. "This distance, the silence, you acting like you're not even here half the time. I can't keep going like this. It's like I'm living with a stranger." She took a deep breath, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "You're tearing us apart." There it was. She wanted me to give her some reassurance, to tell her we could go back to what we were. She was desperate to erase the last few months, to ignore her affair with Jared, to pretend the life we'd had was still intact. But I wasn't interested in playing along. "Maybe you should have thought of that before," I replied coldly. She flinched, and I could see the realization in her eyes, the understanding that I wasn't the man she could manipulate anymore. She had gambled with our marriage, with my trust, and now she was facing the consequences. "Mike," her voice cracked, and she looked down, blinking rapidly. "I know I made mistakes. I know I haven't been the wife you deserve. But can't we just try? Can't we start over?" I almost felt a pang of pity. Almost. But the image of those messages from Jared, the betrayal of my own brother, erased any softness I might have felt. I'd carried that pain alone, and now it was her turn to feel it. "You want to start over?" I laughed, the sound cold and humorless. "Beth, you destroyed everything that made this marriage work. You chose that. You wanted secrets, wanted lies. Well, now you can live with them." The color drained from her face, and for a moment, she looked so small, so defeated, that it was hard to recognize her as the woman I once loved. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time, she seemed to understand that there was no fixing this, no way back to the life she'd taken for granted. She took a shaky breath, her hands twisting together in her lap. I thought we'd always find our way back," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "I never thought I'd lose you." Those words should have hurt, should have made me want to reach out, to forgive. But all I felt was a cold satisfaction. She was finally realizing what she'd thrown away, the weight of her betrayal settling heavily on her. "Well," I replied, keeping my voice steady, "now you know what it's like to lose something that mattered." Beth's face crumpled, her control slipping as she lowered her head. I could see her struggling to keep it together, to hold back the emotions she'd refused to face until now. She'd spent so long living in her illusion, and now it was crashing down around her. I watched her, waiting, letting her feel every ounce of the pain she'd caused. And for the first time, I felt at peace. She looked up at me, eyes shining with tears, her face full of regret. "Mike, please can't we just talk? I'll do anything to make it right. Just tell me what you want me to do." I shook my head, feeling the finality of it settle over me. Beth, I wanted a wife I could trust. I wanted a marriage built on honesty. But you made your choice, and now I've made mine. For a long moment, she didn't move, her breath coming in shallow gasps. I could see the truth sinking in, the reality that she had lost me. Not in anger, not in hatred, but in something colder, something that couldn't be repaired. She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to shield against the emptiness in the room. I'm sorry, Mike, she whispered, her voice breaking. For everything. I know it's too late, but I am. I nodded, giving her a look as if she were a stranger, because that's what she had become. Sometimes sorry just isn't enough. And with that, I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her alone in the silence she'd created, in the ruins of a life she'd shattered. After that night, the house was a shell. Beth moved through it quietly, as if even breathing too loudly might disturb the fragile silence between us. She barely met my eyes anymore, retreating into her own guilt. Sometimes, I'd catch her staring at me, but when I looked back, she'd quickly turn away, as if ashamed to be seen. The walls felt like they were closing in around her. She tried to ignore what she'd done, to brush it under the rug, but now she was living in the consequences. Every glance I threw her way reminded her of the choices she'd made, the life she'd so carelessly torn apart. She seemed to shrink into herself, her voice softer, her movements tentative, like she was walking on glass. Our friends noticed the change, too. Sarah, of course, saw right through it. She knew enough of the story now to understand that Beth was unraveling. She'd ask me in quiet tones how I was holding up, if I was handling it okay, her hand on my shoulder in that too familiar way. And I let her. I let her be the comforting friend, knowing her attention was part of the story Beth would inevitably hear. It was all unfolding as I'd planned, each step pushing Beth further into her own web of regret. One evening, Sarah and I met for coffee. We didn't even have to say much. Her sympathy, her soft eyes and understanding nods were all part of the role she'd unknowingly taken on. And later, when she mentioned that Beth had called her, asking how I was doing, her tone shifted. "I don't know, Mike," she said, frowning. She seemed different. Scared, almost. I nodded, feigning nonchalance, though inside I could picture Beth's desperation, the way she'd cling to anyone who might offer her a shred of connection. It was all so predictable, really. She'd created this life, painted this picture of herself that had crumbled beneath her own deceit. And now, even Sarah, once her closest friend, was beginning to see her differently. At home, Beth tried to salvage the remaining pieces of her reputation, attempting to reach out to the friends who'd once admired her. She'd call them up, ask about their lives, try to weave herself back into the fabric of our circle. But people aren't blind. They'd seen the tension, the distance, and I knew they'd heard enough whispers to piece together a version of the story, even if they didn't know the full truth. One night, after yet another failed attempt to break the silence between us, Beth cornered me in the kitchen, her face pale, eyes filled with an intensity that surprised me. "Mike, I know I messed up. I know I don't deserve anything from you," she said, her voice barely steady. "But I can't keep living like this. You're punishing me, and I know I deserve it. But if there's any way at all, to fix this..." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I almost saw a glimpse of the Beth I'd once loved, the one I'd trusted. But I forced myself to remember the lies, the betrayal, the messages with my own brother. The weight of all that hadn't lifted, and it wasn't going to. "Fix this?" I echoed, my voice calm, almost too calm. "Beth, you broke something that can't be fixed. You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed everything we built together. And now you're just realizing the cost." She flinched, her eyes welling up, but she didn't turn away. "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was selfish. I wanted things I thought I'd lost with you, but it was wrong. I know that now. I'd take it back if I could." Her words sounded hollow, and I wondered if she even believed them herself. This wasn't about love, or remorse, or even forgiveness. It was about her finally realizing the depth of the damage she'd done. But that realization had come too late. I wasn't interested in salvaging scraps. "What do you want me to say, Beth?" I asked, my tone icy. That it's all okay? That we can just pick up where we left off? She shook her head slowly, a single tear slipping down her cheek. No, I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, that I never wanted to hurt you like this. I just thought, she trailed off, her voice trembling. I just thought it would be different. For a moment, I said nothing, letting her sit with the emptiness. Then I looked at her, a steady gaze that I knew she couldn't hold. You thought wrong. She nodded, a shuddering breath escaping her lips. And then she turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the remnants of what used to be our life. The days that followed were quieter than ever. Beth stopped trying to reach out, as if she'd finally accepted that there was no fixing what she'd broken. She moved around the house like a ghost, avoiding eye contact, barely speaking, as if to disturb nothing. I knew she was coming to terms with the reality she created, the emptiness that she'd have to live in from now on. And it felt right. It felt like justice. One night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I wondered if she'd leave, if she'd pack up and go, disappear into the silence she'd spent months avoiding. But every morning, she was still there, her movements quiet, her presence fading with each passing day. She didn't have to go anywhere. She was already living in the ruins she'd made. It was what she deserved. Beth left on a rainy Saturday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, watching the rain streak down the window when she walked in, a small suitcase at her side. She was pale, hair pulled back, eyes red-rimmed and empty. She stood there for a moment, waiting, as if hoping I'd ask her to stay. I didn't say a word. Finally, she took a shaky breath and broke the silence. I thought it'd be easier if I left. Her voice was barely a whisper, heavy with exhaustion. I can't keep pretending, not after everything. I know you're never going to forgive me. She was right. Forgiveness wasn't an option. I couldn't look at her without remembering the betrayal, the lies, the life she'd carelessly torn apart. She must have known that all along. She just hoped I'd be the man who'd let her off easy. I wasn't that man anymore. I think it's for the best, I replied, my voice steady. You got what you wanted, Beth. Freedom, excitement, the life you chose. Now you can have it. She winced, her hand tightening around the handle of her suitcase. That's not what I wanted, Mike. Not really, she murmured. I thought I was missing something. I don't know, that I'd lost myself somehow. I was wrong. I see that now. The words hung in the air, hollow and sad, but they meant nothing to me. Apologies don't rebuild trust. Regret doesn't erase betrayal. She'd made her choice, and now she had to live with it. Take care of yourself, Beth, I said, meeting her gaze one last time. I hope you find what you're looking for. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and she nodded, swallowing hard. I know I don't deserve it, but I hope you find happiness too, Mike. I really do. I didn't respond. I just watched as she turned and walked out the door, her silhouette fading into the rain. As her car pulled away, a strange calm settled over me. The house was quiet, empty, but it didn't feel hollow anymore. It felt like the weight I'd carried for months was finally gone, replaced by something steadier, a quiet kind of freedom I hadn't known I needed. The life I thought we'd share was over, but in that emptiness, I saw the chance to rebuild on my own terms, to find my own peace. Beth was gone, and she'd taken the last pieces of our broken marriage with her. All that remained was mine, just me, my future, and a sense of clarity that had come at a high price. And for the first time, that felt like enough.